artists of yesteryears faced a whole lot of struggles when creating music, and their identity perhaps had everything to do with how jazz music is consumed in South Africa. Now let's have a discussion with Sam Mathe, and of course on the issue of their identity was also affected in the process, and some names were changed, to sort of accommodate people who can't pronounce their indigenous names. Author and prolific jazz writer Sam Mathe released a new book titled From Kippies to Kippies, Portraits of South African Jazz, Soul and Pop Artists. Now, the book has biographies of not only jazz musicians, but South African musicians. Mathe hopes to restore their identity and inform new audiences. And he joins us now in studio for more. A very good morning to you, Ndade Mathe. Thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Morning. How are you, Sims?
Good to see you. Good to have you on the show this morning.
Good to see you too, man.
Kippie to Kippies and beyond. I know that Mweketsi is one of those whom you document in this book, but
Definitely.
There's a whole host of other jazz artists that you're documenting.
Yeah.
So why specifically focus on him as the title of this book?
I'll say before I answer that, let me indicate upfront that I've got over 300 entries of these musicians in this book.
Right.
And
which means you're documenting 300 jazz musicians?
Over 300 jazz,
wow.
pop, and other styles.
Right.
Yes. Right. And they varies from the, let's go back to the 20s. From the 20s to the current generation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Approximately 5 generations in all. And
I understand that you're not only focusing on jazz musicians, but other musicians from other genres as well.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
But to go back to your question on why Kippie, back in the 50s, Kippie occupied the central role as a jazz musician during the golden era of South African jazz, what is also called the Sophathan era. So he has had a huge influence on his contemporaries and subsequent generations, notably people like Hugh Masekela, Abdullah Ibrahim, Keifa Semenya, Jonas Gwangwa, the list goes on and on. He was actually their teacher and their mentor.
And how does this book reflect your own journey in the jazz music scene in South Africa? Well,
I'll say the first time I heard a Kippie Mweketsi track, it's something happened to me.
Yes.
And this was, in my childhood, I was about 7. This is 1975, when I first heard Chona. And it was the era of Abdullah Ibrahim's Manenberg, which was released, I think, just a year before, 1974. But 1975, then we had this wonderful album by Pat Machikiza and Kippie Mweketsi. It was a partnership of the two, Pat on Pat Machikiza on piano and Kippie Mweketsi on alto, and a whole lineup of very fantastic South African musicians. So that sound, it just stayed with me from that time. And as a student later in my teens, I rediscovered this music via cassettes, because at that stage I was now a music, not much of a compiler, but that's what we were doing actually, because we were using the blank cassettes to dub, as it was known, to tape this music. But also I was a collector. I used to go to outlets like Kohino to actually buy it. And that is where I bought my first Chona album in cassette form back, I would say, around 1987.
Gosh, dubbing music was such a headache, though.
Yes.
And then you had to dub a certain radio show, and you dub a particular song, and then the radio announcer comes.
To make sure that the
radio announcer comes, and then you have to edit that part out.
Exactly.
Gosh, you've come a long way. Hey? You've really come a long way. So let's talk about the content.
I to master that skill of taping the music.
Let's talk about the content that is in this book. What kind of content is there? Do you document their biographies? Do you document their histories? Do you document the kind of music that they're producing?
We can divide it into two. We have the biographies.
Okay.
And then the biographies will have like a date of birth, place of birth, and at the end there will be a discography, what the musician has contributed to the great South African songbook.
Okay.
Yeah. But on the other hand, we'll have a timeline So my timeline starts right in the beginning of the turn of the century with the publication of Nkosi Sikeleli Africa.
Yeah.
This is around 1897, I guess, and then it goes on with all these milestones in the history of South African music,
Yeah.
particularly jazz.
Yeah, considering that it is different biographies of the more than 300 jazz artists that you've documented with the actual correct names and birthdays and all that data. And, there's been some consternation with regards to incorrect names being used. And that particular jazz artist goes with that incorrect name for the rest of their legacy.
True.
So how much damage do you think it has had on the identities of these artists?
Well, I'll say a lot, particularly the fact that it also impacted on the copyright issue.
Oh, yes.
Yes, the copyright issue was very big, but also they were not credited in certain instances. A classic example will be Margaret Singana, but her real name was actually Margaret Mcingana. So in the book, I restore. In the book, I've restored that.
Yeah.
That her true identity. But at the time, she was the name was just changed arbitrarily. I don't think there was any consultation with the artists. It was about convenience for the record companies and the people behind her music.
And some eras are home affairs eras, and those artists find themselves carrying that era for the rest of their lives. For the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Kippi Mwekezi, actually in Chona, the spelling is Moketsi. So we had to fix that as well.
And there's also the issue of Dorothy Masuku, who are sometimes referred to Masuka.
Yes.
And sometimes referred to Dorothy Masuku.
Exactly. And she had to set the record straight. She actually set the record straight when I spoke to her. She said, no, my name is Masuku.
Right.
Yes. But all along, she was Dorothy Masuka.
Ndate Mathe, you have filled a gap that not everybody has managed to fill in terms of documenting the history of jazz music in particular and documenting the history of, some of these jazz artists. And it's quite a pity that in South Africa, we don't have dedicated journalists focusing on jazz music. We don't have a jazz magazine. We don't have a jazz TV. So how much erosion do you think this has had in terms of the documentation of jazz music and us appreciating the history of jazz?
Well, firstly, we have a very rich jazz heritage. We are regarded as a powerhouse outside the United States. In the world, we are highly regarded as a jazz nation. Unfortunately, the documentation doesn't match that.
True.
Yeah, so it's a very rich heritage which unfortunately has been neglected. The reason why I decided to write this book was to try and fix that, because I realized that a lot of information was getting lost. An older generation of these musicians, they were passing.
Right.
And the ones that were left behind, they didn't really know much, because there wasn't much of asking. At the time, in the context of the past, under apartheid, I don't think the issue of heritage featured that much. But I think after 94, people like myself, a young journalist in the newsroom at the time, I started thinking about issues of heritage and identity. Alongside, of course, because the anti-apartheid narrative was now being done, over and over again in terms of what was written about it.
Yeah.
But it was a time to really reflect on who we are and what we have contributed. So in this case, I looked at, I focused on the musicians.
And on the issue of identity, how do you foresee the portraits of the various jazz artists and musicians to the understanding of South Africa's cultural identity, as it were?
Well, I think currently there is what I would call an awareness and a consciousness in terms of the significance of these musicians and what they have left behind.
Yes.
I see that happening in the form of films, particularly documentaries, and of course there are other books From Kippies to Kippies is a contribution to a scholarship that is already there, in a sense. So I think there is that recognition of the rich heritage that they've left behind, but also an embracing of what is currently happening, because we've got a very talented generation of musicians currently who have learned from the masters like Kippi Kids.
And no doubt jazz music has a unique place in South Africa's musical landscape. And
Definitely.
What do you think sets South African jazz music apart from its global counterparts? I mean, you just mentioned that the South African jazz scene is the second biggest after the United States.
Yeah.
So what sets it apart from the rest?
Well, I think there are two factors there.
Yes.
The fact that, firstly, the influence from outside. A lot of these musicians were influenced by, especially the elder generation, they were influenced by the music they saw in the films, American films, and the records. But they've also tapped into their own indigenous musical heritage. So they've got their own idiom, they've got their own accent in that regard. And then the combination of the two is a winning formula. It is an advantage for South Africans that Americans or British musicians don't have.
Right.
Exactly.
Dr. Mathe, great chatting to you, man. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And well done on this book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for just documenting jazz musicians and the history of jazz music. And I certainly hope that this will give birth to jazz shows on TV, on radio, jazz magazines, and the resuscitation and the revival of jazz clubs, which have faltered and died a natural death.
And well done to you as well for the successful summit.
Thank you, man.
On Kilimanjaro.
Well, thank you, man. Thank you. It was,
stuff.
it really was a life-changing moment.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that was renowned journalist and author Sam Mathe talking to us about his latest book, Kippi to Kippies and Beyond, portraits of SA jazz, soul and pop artists